I'm very happy to have the honor of chairing this morning papers which already from what I have read are extremely exciting. And the first speaker will be Pavel Lourier. Where is Pasha? Okay, I thought he was discouraged already. Pasha will speak about the Society of Eastern Sogdiana on the eve of Islamization. And, well, it's actually based on very, very new research, on new material. Okay, Pasha, you start.
Okay. Hello, thank you very much. So I would like everybody here, extend my gratitude to the organizers of this wonderful event, to the University of California, Berkeley, to the ISO of New York, to Collège de France for organizing this wonderful event. I think it's great to have Sogdian conferences from time to time in beautiful places. Yes, and so in this presentation, I would like to share with you some ideas about how to understand the society, the life of the people in the eastern part of Sogdiana, mostly in the late 7th, early 8th century, but also with more closer look to the later centuries. And so this research is basically what I'm doing during my sabbatical, to say, at the French Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris during these 2 semesters, and which is an attempt to what I said above. So what is the region we are speaking about? It's the upper course of Zarafshan Valley, from around Panjikent broadly to Hisarak in the mountains opposite modern today's Marchkat, but also other places. So it coincides with the present-day Tajikistan, so which is on one side good. So all this material are put together in the discourse of archaeology of Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic, and then independent Tajikistan. So and on the other side, it's not so good, because it's of course always better to put together the materials from different lands, because I notice quite often that the archaeologists working in Tajikistan are not very much aware of what happens in the neighboring Uzbekistan and vice versa. So I understanding this, I speak mostly about Tajikistan area. So it is Sogdiana. What is Sogdiana? Sogd. The word Sogd until 19th century in Tajik and some Uzbek dialects perhaps as well, it meant a lowland rich in water. So the flat land which is abundantly watered and which has consequently very good crops. So this is the situation which we can find in central Sogdiana from Samarkand to Bukhara, more or less. The flatland, and so everywhere you can find the tipas, the small or big hills, which are the remains of ancient structures of different periods, like Dabusia or Ziauddin today. When we go to the mountains, to the upper part of Zarafshan Valley, the situation is completely different. So it's a narrow valley, rather highly elevated, with mountains on 2 sides, and consequently it is important there where the amount of sunshine reduces because of the mountains. So the day is shorter, and so the Soiru and Oftobru, the sunny side, the shadow side of the valley, is a very important issue there. And another important issue, that the soil, the arable soil, is not abundant, so it is very limited. So this territory cannot provide enough food for a big population. The population is very small. And of course the highlands, the mountains, the elevation from more than 2,000 meters high at Hisarak to Bukhara, which is 300 meters above the sea level. So it is completely crucial. So if we take the average temperature of the year, in Marchkat opposing Hisarak, it's something similar to Stockholm and Oslo, It is a bit warmer than Petersburg in any event, but in Panjshir, it's like Paris, a paradise, and in Bukhara it's a bit like Rome. But it is all, on the same latitude of 39 north. Of course, in our work, in our approach to the society, to any other events, we are deeply related to the sources, what the sources can tell, what can we extract from these sources. And the sources are of different nature, of course, so they are archaeological data. So first of all, I will operate with excavations of Panjshir Kent and at Hisarag, high in the mountains, which I direct during the last decade, co-direct or a bit more. And also the archaeological material from other sites of the area, Mount Moog, Gardani Hisar, Kum, Navruz Shah, excavated by Yusuf Yakubov and Sanjar Shah, for which I expect comments from Michael Shenkar. Yeah, so of course there are many surveys, and recently the 2 volumes of the archaeological map of the Zarafshan, of the Tajik part of Zarafshan Valley have been published. 2 volumes of archaeological map, each one like 400 pages, and written data. Among written data, the most important are, of course, Sogdian documents from Mount Moog, which were left in that castle of Mount Moog in 722 with the events of the defeat of Devashtij by Arab forces. I think I don't need in this auditory to explain what was that and what is the value of these documents, but maybe just to mention that yesterday I learned that the documents from Mount Moog have been included into the UNESCO list of documentary heritage, world documentary heritage. So now we are under UNESCO umbrella, like many sites mentioned here. The documents are also protected by UNESCO. I don't know what will be the consequences. Maybe nothing, most likely, but still. So there is also other written data, brief passages and narrative sources, epigraphy from the area, and there is comparative sources. So archaeological sites in the neighboring areas, mostly outside of Tajikistan, in Samarkand, Jartepe, Shaharistan, Tugunbulak, dear Michael and Farhad, Paikent, Kafirkala, and so on. Written sources on Sogdiana, Ustrushana, which are quite numerous, Chinese, Arabic, and so on. Persian epigraphy of the area of the mountains of 11th to 18th century, which was masterfully edited by Ahrar Mukhtarov in some 50 years ago. Muslim architecture of the area, like Muhammad Bashara Mausoleum and fantastic wood carvings, traveler and ethnographic accounts from the 19th and 20th century, and especially valuable are the documents of 16th to early 20th century from the area, which are mostly in Persian language and Persian script, and so which was the focus of my research during the last months. So when I started that project, I thought that I have to work with some 150 documents, but later it appeared that they are almost 3,000 ones published or just published in short extracts. So it was a large amount of material which was not so much known to me before that. So it is Persian handwritten text with a number of Arabic quotations written sometimes in a nice script, sometimes in ugly script, but it is never clear script, so there are never all dots put together in these documents, but they shed very much light on the society, on the economy, on the lifestyle of the mountains. And of course, this comparative study of other neighbors. And so in this lecture, if the time would allow me, I would like to address some questions. What was the life and of agriculturalists, the main part of population? What were the crafts and how did they change with the course of time? Why we don't notice slavery there in the long Dure history from 7th to 20th century? The forms and geography of government. Here I think I can give a more coherent picture. Urbanism and absence of urbanism, religions, beliefs, migrations, and what happened with continuity and rupture in this territory during more than a millennium. So let us turn first to the Mount Mook documents. And so we see here how I put together the different denomination of various peoples mentioned there. So there is a series of nobility, close and far away, from Kagan and Chinese emperor, Arabic emirs, to the rulers with the titles Mrai or Huv and elders and so on. Other officials, the bureaucrats like a steward, a general, park supervisor, as France suggests, craftsmen and traders, Huacar, the trader community, the pergamon maker. So what I read recently is Sagar Karak, the saddle maker, in one of the documents, and the folk population called altogether Karikar workers, or Corbe workers are Kare and Mraz Aide, helper and Nav community, which is a very important word in that text. So I will not recapitulate France's paper yesterday about the depiction of the Naf of the community of Samarkand in Kafir Kala wooden panels. Yeah, but to mention that in Mount Mook document there are altogether above 20 attestations of the word Naf. And in some cases, this word Naf clearly relates to the city community. So, for example, on the document A13, which is perhaps related to the tax of bridge. So this is, the letter is from Panjakent minister to and from the Naf, from the population to Tarkhan. So the population is active in some decision-making. The community, but also we have the community of villages, and so the important document is B6 from Dargaoud community Anchantak, Hun and Khartak, from Falmaoud community Anuch Frihojak, from Pahut community Fraz Karshvyar, from Vars community Vizrachian and Vardian. So these are some representatives, some people of the community. Lifshitz thought, the principal editor of these documents, and happily my teacher, thought that these people were the porters from the community. So they brought some goods, some agricultural products from these villages. The villages are located like that, all to the east of Mount Mook. Vars is Varzimunoro, is I need today, and so otherwise it can be supposed that they were representatives of community, but it's difficult to say. So if we go to the late medieval period of Kohistan, according to documents, to the traveler observation, we see that most of the population were owners of taxed plug lands, which were called milki haraji, and houses, also household building, often orchards, and so on. And the property in inheritance deeds, in sales, and so on could vary, like 20 times in size. So the size of the plots could be different. It was not a egalitarian community, and it's very, very important. And so there were no basically landless peasants, unlike Uratubet to the north, for example. It is equally, the landless people would not have something like inheritance deeds, of course, because they had nothing to inherit, but the travelers also said that everybody had their plots. So if the plot is big, they could hire some poorer people or just organize what is called khashar in Tajik, which is a kind of a help in the work. So the people of the village came to the bigger plot to help to till the land for some natural goods, for some food and so on. There was feudal lands, of course, which were mostly waqf, the charity, or charity in square braces, for religious buildings. So, in fact, giving the property into the waqf meant not only its giving to the mosque or to the holy place and so on, but rather to secure it, because the person who gave this land the charity property, he was nominated mutawali, the steward this Vakf, and it was inherited. So he and his progeny would get a certain percentage of this products of the Vakf. Yeah, and it was much more secure than just milk, like a real, not ordinary property. And there were rarely military officers who had tax exempt as well, milki khuri halis. When we look to the rural society of the 7th, 8th century, of the early Middle Ages, we have a very good material from Gardani Hisar, or Madm, which is a small site situated not far from Mount Mug, which was excavated completely by Yusuf Yakubov. And here, apart from a small fortress and a palace, here we have 3 lanes where there are houses. These are houses of the agricultural population. Quite, of course. But if we look here, we see that they are different, yeah? So they could be from 1 room, like this one, 2, 3, or 4 rooms like this or this one. So they could be bigger, they could be smaller. Again, it was not egalitarian community at all. And what is important, yeah, what we see, for example, here, 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 and so on, were the grain chests, were the granaries. So each house had its own granary. So, and each house had its own kitchen. So each house had its own income in grain and its independent economy. That's quite important. So it is very important sites. The archaeological site, they can be important, not important, spectacular, not spectacular. So sometimes the spectacular site is not really important. This is on the contrary, so it's not spectacular at all, but it's very, very important for our study, Gardani Hisar. So it was kind of rising from the below to above on the slope, like some modern villages, like for example Vishap in upper part of Aini. So all the houses are built one above another along the slope. So this is how the granaries look like, because it's also very important to know that in the most houses of Panjakent, in all houses which I excavated during my time, at least, we have the remains of granaries. They don't survive very well, often because they were usually on the upper floor of the house. So because the mice, they don't like to go upstairs, so they want to be on the ground level. So they were often covered with baked bricks and with plaster, like this central one, which remains. It's also the upper floor. So also, all the houses had their granaries. Sometimes they were smaller, sometimes they were very, very, very big, which can amount like 6 tons of grain. But still they are in every house. So in Hisarak, the situation is approximately the same. So we have excavated only 2 households there. So each one of them has a kitchen, like this one, with tandir, with oven, and so on. And here is another room where you can find a part of the grain chest as well. So that's how it looks. So these are 2 houses. One is here. Another is here. This one is excavated completely. Here we need 1 more season to finish. Which show that they are attached to one another, and all of them had this kind of so-called chapels. They're rooms with fireplace, decorated fireplace attached to one wall, and sufas along 3 other walls. And it's important that the entrance is also usually has this kind of tambour wall, which protects the coming of the fresh air inside. So according to my idea, because of the quantity of these rooms, first of all, they were not like I will show a photo a bit later, they were not like something like sacral home, sanctuaries and so on, but rather the winter house, the winter lodging, for the winter life. So we can remember that the climate there is like Oslo and Stockholm. So these are how the recent houses looked like. So there are many publications, and also we have the kitchens, we have storages, and so on. So we don't have the place for the kettle inside the house. The kettle was kept outside. So these are also one of the Panjakent areas, which has also granaries here, and also this is a long line of granaries, for example. So in most early medieval sites of the region, excavated widely we see houses of a rather unequal size. All the houses had granaries. They are also of unequal size. This is the case of Panjakent, Hisarak, Mount Gardani Hisar, but it is not the case of Shahristan in Ustroshana, for example, or Paikent in Bukhara. So far I remember in Shahristan 1 there were no granaries in the houses. So we cannot extrapolate this model to all of Sogdiana. So on the contrary, in Shahristan and in Paikent there are kind of modular houses which suggest an absolutely different type of living. Corvée duty, which is called Ark in Sogdian, is attested in 2 documents from Mount Moog, but one of them clearly says that it is something exceptional. So the people who were hired for this corvée duty, first of all, they were removed far away from Falgar to Madrushkat, which is 150 kilometers from one another, and they immediately escaped when they had to work hard. So, and all the supplies of the agricultural products in the documents, be it wheat, barley, grain, wine, or fruit, came from villages, so never from persons or officials. So the supply was directly associated with the villages. So it was the village who was supporting that. Of course, this we don't know what were the reasons for having that land. I would suggest that it was inherited, but was it could it be for sale? We are not sure. In Mount Moog documents, we don't have any one of the selling of land. We have the documents of selling of constructions. And in Bactrian documents, which are abundantly on the land trade, in all the cases we have the reference that this is sold because so and so, because I don't have means to pay taxes for that. So it seems that at that point the market of the land was not not something natural, so they needed some explanations for that. So if any one of us would decide to buy or sell land or buildings or whatever, we don't need to explain why we do that. It's our business. Here it is not. So it was a kind of emergence of market of the land, I think. Another element of the community life, which we see very often in the later documents, are the arguments mostly about pasture grounds. So the earliest one is from Deminara, the upper part of Zarafshan Valley, 17th century, one of the most uppermost villages, which says about the quarrel about the people from Deminara itself and some newcomers who wanted to pasture their flocks on that territory. So we should have in mind 2 things. First, that this region has very fertile alpine grounds. So even today, many herds from the lowlands of Tajikistan are moved for the summer pasture there, which has alpine things. The other thing is the Islamic laws, according to which the non-pluged lands are no man's land. So everybody can use them in a way they want. And so one of the cases in Islamic law is that if somebody would till the land, would convert some no one's land, Mayita, into a pluged land, he will receive it as his property, is his milki kharaji, the taxed property. According to the adat, to the normal law, not religious law, of course, these pastures were divided, but they were divided not into individual persons or families, but rather with the families. And so this is a quarrel about Ragif and Reomut two villages in Matcha, 1905. So when there was a land which was traditionally belonged to Ragiv as a pasture. But then the people from Revamutk, 3 people came there and made part of it their own land, their own agricultural land, farmland. And so that was the problem. So from one side, traditionally it belongs to Ragiv, but the people from Revamutk, they made it plug land according to Islamic law. So there is a series of 5 documents about that, and it's even possible to trace exactly where it was located on the map. So the story ends up that these newcomers from Revamutk are allowed to use that land because the people of Ragiv, they couldn't provide the document that this land belongs to them. And among these 5 documents, in fact, there is one telling that this land, this pasture lands belongs to Ragiv. But it was found, it was purchased from a person at Revamutk. So they had it at Revamutk, but they didn't show it up in this deed 100-something years ago. I would expect that some things like that happened in early medieval times, but I'm not easy to answer. So about crafts and about trade. So we have very much of that in Panjakian, so where bazaars have been excavated. As for Hisarak, the idea is, according to Mount Muk documents, where it is quite sure that March cut of Mount Muk documents is Hisarak, so it is very often associated with production of leather. And in fact, in our excavations, we have a big amount of leather fragments found, sometimes made of quite good quality. The more recent documents, they say about the existence of weavery in that land. By the way, the weavers were mostly men and not women in that case. And of course what we usually say about handicrafts, but in fact we mean pottery. So in Panjakian there is numerous pottery, and it is something like 90% made with potter's wheel. So we have little traces of the production. So in Sanjar Shah there is only one plan. Yes, I know. Thank you. Of kiln, but well, I don't know if there are any other material about that. We don't even know what kind of pottery was produced there. And in Panjakian, we know about at least one bronze casting workshop and a glass workshop in the outskirts of the city. And the pottery from Hisarak and from other mountainside is usually handmade. So it is a different tradition. We have like 25-30% are wheeled pottery, the other are handmade pottery, which is a long mountain tradition. So you see here the photo of 100-something years ago from Ignobis, and they decided to show in front of their group photo this pottery which was made by themselves in a very primitive way, and which that they use. So this system of handmade pottery of the mountains, it continues up to very recent times. So there is a very good book by Petchereva on that. So no slaves and no slides. Because of that, so in Mount Muk documents we don't encounter real slaves in the real life. So every address in the letter is from your humble servant, from your humble slave, but it doesn't mean real slavery. And in the sites also we have very little data of some miserable life somewhere. Maybe this room 6 here, they mention it, Hisarak, which resembles these chapels, but is very, very more simple. So this is a good chapel, by the way, the chapel. You can say it like a master bedroom. In today's terms. And this is this very small room for somebody, maybe for a guest, maybe for dependent, maybe for village full Maybe for a slave, we don't know. Yeah, and of course there were power holders everywhere. So strongholds and palaces are virtually in all sides. For example, Hisarak, where I have the palace citadel one here, and this is Shahristan, the main living quarter. In 1870, during so-called Iskandarkul expedition, the fortresses, Kurgan they were called, were in several sites. They are mostly destroyed today, unlike this one in Aburdan, which seems to be also the castle of Babur, who escaped to Macha on his way from Fergana, from Madurai Nahr to India. And there were different power holders of different titles in different villages of Mount Mook documents. So I don't give this list here. So in different villages, the titles of these rulers were different. We cannot say that Hveshtak was a normal term. So in different places, they were different. What were the villages which supported Mount Mook? So this is a quantitative approach. Which of the neighboring villages are mentioned most of all? We can go to the map. So Mount Mook is here. So the most mentioned is Iskadar, Haksikat, and Zaravak, and Evshisht, all located on the northern, on the sunny side of the river, and Mount Mook is here. So main supports were here, and Madb and Kum, which are quite close to Mount Mook, are mentioned more rarely. And the Huvu rulers. So apart from Devashtich Huvu himself, there is a number of other Huvus of that region, where they could be. So my hypothesis is that the Huvu domains of Mount Mook correspond to the small regions, Viloyat, Vulus, or Bekstva, of the late medieval period. So that's how they're located: Avtobruye, Magian and Farab, Kshtut, Falgar, Fan, and Matcha. And vilayats of this late medieval, early modern period were also corresponded to Darul Qaza, the judge courts, where from most of the documents come. Then Farab is usually as a part of Magian, also there are exceptions. And Yagnov was most often part of Fan. The centers of vilayats fluctuated. So it could be Oburdon, Paldorak, or Marchkat for Matcha, Varzimunon, or Urmetan, or Iskadar for Falgar. Having said that, we return to the geography of Mount Mook documents. So according to the paper of 2001, Vurzvadekhovo was living in Talibarzu, Roston Khusar Huvu near Samarkand, here is Rost. Partan Huvu was in Shavdar mountains, it is here. And we can also add the ruler of Varakhsar, Varakhchik Huvu, mentioned in one of the documents. Identified Huvu seats of Upper Zarafshan. Kushtut Huvu is, of course, the vilayet of Kushtut River. Kuruch Huvu, the rivulet Kuruch, it is here, and on it there are no significant remains, and it flows into Zarafshan just next to the important village, now the center of the rayon Aini, previously Varzimunor. So it was the Kuruch Huvu was living here, and perhaps he controlled what was later Falgar and now Aini province of Tajikistan. Marchkat Huvu, of course, was the ruler of Marchkat, which is Hisarak and Macha. Other Huvu seats must be something comparable to Hisarak. What can we do? If we look to what the judges of Kishtut were controlling, it was not only Kishtut Valley here, but also the region to the west of it, including Zavron, Zimtut, Verzikanda, and sometimes even Mazari Sharif. And here on this territory we have a significant site of Navruz Shah. So it's how it's looked from the air. These are some fun. So it's also contemporary to our events. So we can have a good guess to suggest that the ruler of Kishtut was located there. Another Huvu is Imdukch Huvu. Usually it was called Admdukch, the ruler of Al-Malik, but the second letter, I'm very sorry, doesn't look like L. It looks like it looks like Y with a crack above. So it's Emduk, and it's a Matka to the west of Urmitan. which could be center of Aftab-Ruya, the sunny side of the Panjakent Valley. Yeah, Sarvchik-Khuvu could be perhaps the ruler of Sarvoda, which is the Fan River, where this is a site, but the site is not really very antique, but nearby there is a Kuhisurh, very close to it, with the remains of the idol. Yeah, and Partanj-Khuvu chair, according to Lifshitz, it corresponds to Pardan, the upper course of Magyaran and the pass between Magyaran and Farab, which is attested in the documents of 16th century. According to Franz and Etienne, he was active in Shavdar Mountains to the southeast of Samarkand. And it's a common feature in toponymy that an old name of the river survives in the upper course. So perhaps Pardan is the old river or the old name of Magyaran. So if Pardan is the old name of Magyaran, the ruler of Pardan would be located along Magyaran. In its lower course, we have Sanjar Shah, yeah, so which is a big site. It's most of its surface is a bit later, around 740s, but there is a great amount of pottery of the earlier period. So I suggest that Cher, the ruler of Pardan, had his residence, or one of the residences, and the great site of Sanjar Shah. So I know that I have basically very little time, but just few words that when we started Hisarak, we thought that we are working on the only mountain urban site in the area. Now the situation changes. We have Tugunbulak and Tashbulak in the Sanjar Valley. We have Karan in Darvaz, so that's how Karan looks like. It's much bigger than Hisarak. And this is Tugunbulak, and so according to the leader scanning, it is much bigger, very many times, half time of Samarkand, a very big site. Yeah, so that's, well, I think in any case, this leader thing have to be proven by real excavations. Yeah, but in any case, we can be sure that the urbanism at that time was much more developed in the mountains than today, when it is really absent. Yeah. So this is the site of Hisarak. So one of the differences between the mountains and the lowlands is the absence of coins. So these are many coins from Panjakent. So this year we had more than 100 coins. Yeah, and in Hisarak, after more than 10 seasons, we have just 3 coins. Different was their funerary customs. So in lowlands we have nauses and ossuaries. In the mountains, we have kurgans, like this one, which is not fully excavated, and stone chest graves, which I hope we will finish it in this year. So it is a different funerary custom, which it means a different ideas of population, different religion. So the names, the theophoric names from the mountains and from the lowlands are basically similar, but important point is that in the lowlands, what we have are paintings and reliefs. We don't have the three-dimensional pictures of the gods, but from the mountains, we have them abundantly. So there are real three-dimensional idols, which is, I think, also an important feature. Yeah, and also the languages. So unfortunately, Martin Schwarz is not here. Yeah, just to say that Yagnobi, for a number of reasons, cannot be the real descendant of literary Sogdian. Yeah, so coming to the end, so just 1 or 2 minutes. So what we see between 8th and 9th century, so it's a rupture, so it's a change of language, so on the most part, apart from Yagnob. Change of religion and of many customs. So now all the population there are quite an obedient Sunni Hanafi. Loss of urbanism and professional craftsmanship. It appeared until 12th century. In 12th century epigraphy we have professional Haddad ironsmiths. Development of monetary economy. So we didn't have it in the early time, but in the 19th century, so all the deals are made in money. So they knew money quite well. Maybe deforestation, but I don't have really clues, real proofs for that. We can discuss it later. And what is in continuity? It's the same basic crops. Maybe there was a newcomer of Islamic period, which was mulberry. We don't find it in early texts, but in 19th century it's abundant. It's very important there. So it's not only for silk. The silk is not grown there, but for their food. So the dried mulberry is a very important source of protein in winter and spring. The same model of agriculture, if I understand it correctly, family plots of different sizes. Strong village community, it is still there today. You come there, you will see it. Home crafts, home production of pottery is also continuation. Construction materials and techniques are also the same. System of power nodes, if I understand it good, this location of Huvu and of Bekstva is more or less the same. And preservation of language in Yagnob, and of course the mountains remain the same. Thank you very much for your attention.
Michael?
Yeah, Pavel, thank you very much for this wealth of new and exciting material and for new ideas. I think that we'll need much more time to properly digest it. I have two small comments and one question. First of all, at Sanjar Shah, we have two pottery kilns. One was excavated by Firuz in area 6 and properly documented, unlike the old one that you've shown that was excavated by the German Tajik team, and the percentage of well-made pottery at Sanjar is roughly comparable with what we have in Panjikent. Yeah. And well, regarding the three-dimensional statues, of course, they were also abundantly present originally in the cities, like in Panjikent and Samarkand. We know it from sources. I mean, they are not preserved, but we know that statues stood from temples. Qutayba burned them. I mean, it's beyond doubt.
I agree. I think the reason for the contrast, rightly pointed out by Pasha, is that they didn't survive in sites in the plains because all temples there were pillaged by the Arabs. And they survived more in the upland because there was less pillage. And sometimes they were hidden in caves.
And also we do have fragments of statues of Nana from Temple 2 in Panjikent, don't we?
The very archaic one.
Yeah, but also, yeah. And my question is about the Naf, of course. Because, well, we usually think that in the villages, the peasants, they were serfs and they were subordinated to the aristocracy, while in cities, the citizens, they were free and the Naf was self-governed. So how do you think the Naf functioned in the villages?
Okay, thank you very much. So for the first thank you for the considerations on them, or for the information about the second kiln. Yes, I should have included it. Yeah. As for the statues, so when we look even to the to the devastated, burned temples on the lowlands, we see that the position of this sculpture where it should be or where something survived, so like Kurgan Tepe, you showed it here recently, it was in the niche. And niche is not the sculpture in the niche is just done only from the front. The backside, so on that photo it was attached to the niche, so it was a high relief rather than a statue. Yeah, as for the village community and the chiefs, so I don't think they were real serfs. The relation, of course, almost all of the sites there, we have a residence part and we have rulers' palace, fortress. And so on. So they were, of course, in the close relation, and a lion's share of the income went to that ruler. But I think that the population of the village, it also had its own rights. So if we look to the later periods, yeah, we have these kurgans in many villages, the small fortresses, but the people of the village, they formed this community. which was important, for example, for the deeds about the pasture grounds. So there was a dichotomy, there was a binary opposition between them, and they were interrelated with one another.
Sasha?
No,
Adam.
Thanks for the presentation. We've actually been reading some of the MOOC documents with our graduate students this year, so it's nice to see some of the latest thinking about the MOOC documents. I just had maybe it's a bit of a basic question, but it actually occurred to me that I don't really know in terms of size, how does the site of Mount Mook compare with the other settlements nearby? Is it actually bigger, smaller, more important, less important in the contemporary period?
So this is an extreme example of non-spectacular site with great importance. So it is just 5 rooms, so it's like 10 and 10 meters, no more. It's completely excavated, so there is a yard with a fence nearby with no remains of the structures. So it's really very, very small.
So would you even call it a village?
No,
is
we
it
don't
really
have
just
there.
a
We don't
fortress?
have there the village houses. So this Gardani Hisoro, which I spoke much, it's like 8 kilometers from there.
Sasha?
Thank you. In terms of comparison, for example, of houses, Gardani Hisor cannot be compared to Penjiken. Should be compared to still unpublished Aktepe on Zarafshan. Right? If you want logical comparison, because Aktepe is the same type of settlement near Penjiken. Secondly, about the sizes of houses, when you were trying to estimate what are large, well, more important one, less important one, you cited number of rooms.
Yeah.
What you need to cite is the size of a plot. Plots are pretty much the same. The couple in the left side, which are smaller, but otherwise they're pretty much the same. And that's very interesting because if you look at it, it looks like there was uniformed population with uniformed economic capacity. What is interesting, however, is that, as much as I understand, it is not that the sizes of these plots in Gardani Hisor not that much different from, for example, Aktepe in Bukhara, excavated by Manilov and Razak Abdurimov, Yuri Petrovich Manilov and Razak Abdurimov. So, as Raspopova tried to point out, there was a huge difference between economic status of the city dwellers and villagers. And that is probably more important than social distinction, because these were actually people of different economic, living on a different level of economy. And here I would like once more to cite something that Marshak never actually did in this wonderful article in 1981, where they tried to see the economy of the city, is that the city in Sogdiana is actually living off Silk Road trade. Well, whether it's silk or anything else that is coming, but it's all trade. And that is a special society which actually lives where merchants and merchant class is way more rich than in traditional agricultural society, because money are coming from outside. When every Sogdian goes for his lifetime, buying and selling things, he comes back, he brings with him his cash. And that's why there is such a dichotomy in terms of economic status between villages and the cities. And I think that should be taken into consideration. Otherwise, thank you. It was, to me, brilliant.
Now to next speech, which is, I think, Kate Klissner. Am I right? Yes, I'm right.
Hi, I'm going to try to speak loud, but I want to, as everyone else has, thank the organizers for putting together such an exciting program and for including me, even though I am in a slightly later period. So my research more broadly is interested in tracing the development and spread of technologies, and I come to these questions mostly from an archaeological science perspective, so a little bit different than what we've heard before this. And when I was invited, I decided that the themes of the workshop and the audience may be better placed for a less technical presentation, and that it would be a good forum to discuss some of our broader thoughts about adoption and innovation of these glazed wares, based on my research that is coming from Bukhara and Tashkent. So I'm going to try to keep it less technical. Sorry if it does get a little bit in the weeds. And of course, I couldn't do this without the contribution of my many collaborators, some of whom are in the room, from excavations in Bukhara and long-standing work in Tashkent. So as I mentioned, I'm broadly interested in tracing the development and spread of technologies, and I became interested in early Islamic glazed wares because they have this rapid spread in the 8th and 9th century, as well as successive stylistic development. So the technology is spreading, but it's not remaining static in the way it's being achieved. And that makes them a great medium through which we can investigate some of our broader questions about the transmission mechanisms of technological knowledge and the role of innovation in its continuous spread. And the glazed wares from Central Asia, and Transoxiana in particular, are really well suited for this study because these were the first glazing traditions really in the region. So it's really easy to isolate technological developments and choices in their spread because you don't have influence from those prior technologies. Another really interesting aspect about the glazed ceramics from this region is that they're technologically very complex. So the late Oliver Watson, in his fantastic volume on ceramics from Iran, wrote that it was these Central Asian 10th century slipwares where we see the highest levels of invention in the making of Islamic pottery. And so for those of less familiar with slipwares, we actually haven't talked about them at all yet. These are slipwares, and in general, they have a white slip covering the entire decorative area of the vessel, and then they have red, brown, or black slips applied to create really intricate designs, and on top of that, you have a transparent glaze. And this style of pottery has been recorded at many sites in Central Asia, including Tashkent, Nishapur, Samarkand, Bukhara, Termez, Herat, and those are just the major cities. They've also been found basically at every Islamic site. And while early scholarship into slipwares focused on production in Nishapur and Afrasayab or Samarkand, recent research has really identified more centers of production, including Tashkent, which has been identified as a major producer of slipwares equal to or surpassing the qualities of those made in Nishapur and Samarkand. And our understanding for the production of these wares is continuing to evolve with ongoing excavations, including in Bukhara, which was the Samanid capital. So Soren did a fantastic job yesterday introducing the reasons why archaeological exploration in Bukhara lagged behind other urban centers in the region. But as people are probably aware, this has led to no published systematic study of the pottery from the city itself, and especially the early Islamic pottery from the city, like there has been in some of these other urban centers. And because of that, Bukhara has really been left out of the picture as a producer of slipwares in past literature. The new excavations that Soren talked about yesterday, however, have yielded really rich Samanid and early Karakhanid ceramic, glass, and paleobotanical finds. And these rich ceramic finds have opened up the possibility to systematically determine the provenance of glazed ceramics from the city and determine the scale of local production and technological developments across the early Islamic period, as well as understanding more broadly the role of long-distance trade of ceramics in Central Asia. So we can do a lot of things because we have this rich corpus. We were also fortunate to get access to material that had been studied from Tashkent by Saida Ilyasova in order to characterize that center's production technology. It had already been stylistically analyzed, and therefore round out our understanding of production across Transoxiana, at least from these major urban centers. So before we could talk about technology, we needed to do provenance studies to isolate which goods were locally produced versus which ones were brought into the area through trade or migration. And we used neutron activation analysis, or NAA, and that was chosen because it has a large database of comparable ceramics from across Western and Central Asia. So we can use that database to try to identify any non-local ceramics present in our assemblage. So here's a map of the sites included in the study, marked in red. We also got some material from Paikent and Taraz to also look at some of those more minor centers. And compared to all sites with ceramics that have been studied by NAA in the past. And we lucked out, and why I'm excited to talk about this today, is because there was a very early NAA study done here at Berkeley by Gidi Azarpay, examining 40 early Islamic ceramics from Samarkand and Nishapur. And so we could fold that data directly into our data set for doing group analysis. And the NAA results revealed that there were 5 main compositional groups corresponding to production in the cities of Nishapur, Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, and Taraz. As well as some more minor production, including there was glazed ceramic production in Paikent. And the results clearly show that there was slipware production in Tashkent and Bukhara, which technically we had not proved before this. And while there was local production in these centers, there was also long-distance trade of glazed ceramics in Transoxiana, both coming from Western Asia into the region, but also circulation between the cities in the region. So now that we established the production locations of the ceramics, we could actually then think about their technology, which I think is more exciting. But before we dive in, I do want to take a quick step back and think about why we bother studying technology in the first place. So Marcia and Dobres, I think, offers us a helpful definition for technology that really centers people behind the production of goods. And she says technology is a dynamic, meaningful, and embodied, so a physically experienced form of social practice. Making a pot is not just making a pot, but it's also enacting a cultural tradition. And one of the fundamental principles in studying past technologies is that there are more than one way to perform any given task. You can make a pot 1,000 different ways. But the reason a particular way is favored is culturally defined. It's a learned habit. And differences between the way goods were made can thus provide insights into which groups made them, but also why a certain way was favored over another way. And ceramics themselves are really a valuable medium through which we can study questions related to technology, such as how innovation arose and how knowledge was spread, because they are a fairly dynamic material, and we see noticeable changes in their technology and their decorative style that can occur within a single generation. And Islamic ceramics are an especially good medium for this because their decorative surfaces reflect a lot of technological choices, and we can identify those on the macro and the microscopic level. Additionally, the Islamic period really saw this extraordinary development in glazed wares, including a rapid increase in their production, an increase in the variety and forms of different styles, and we see a spread of this glazing technology, as I mentioned before, into regions that didn't have prior glazing traditions. And that rapid spread offers us the opportunity to investigate how technology spread more broadly across different regions and how exogenous technologies were integrated into pre-existing local ceramic traditions. And therefore, we can begin to think about the role glazed ceramics played in shaping cultural identity. So we can see this rapid spread if we think about the classic narrative for the development of Islamic glazed ceramics. And I'm only going to go through this to emphasize how research has changed this traditional narrative in the past decade or so. So immediately prior to the Islamic period, there weren't a lot of glazes being produced in Western or Central Asia. The only ones were these Sasanian period transparent or semi-opaque monochrome green or turquoise glazes. And these have an alkali lime type glaze. So again, according to this first narrative, the first Islamic glaze wares were produced in the 9th century and are termed Samarra wares. But they were also likely produced in Basra. And they had an opaque white lead glaze. And they were more or less direct imitations of Chinese imports in both their form and their decorative style. It was the imported Chinese wares that served as the influence for the Islamic potters to develop their own traditions, according to their original stories. The style then developed to incorporate blue, cobalt color decoration, as well as lusterware. And from there, the technology spread from this core to more peripheral regions, all by the end of the 9th, early 10th century. By the way, the spread is also across North Africa, but we don't care about that today. So this narrative suggests a pattern where a core region serves as a location for innovation, and then the peripheries import that core originating innovation, with the technology remaining static as it spreads. And in the case for early Islamic ceramics, the spread is considered to have been facilitated by the movement of craftsmen themselves, which is argued because we have this very specific type of updraft kiln with ceramic rods that are being used. That's what those dots are. And we see this throughout the Islamic world. In the past decade, however, as I mentioned, this narrative has come into question. So researchers have argued that the first Islamic glazewares were actually produced in the 8th century in Egypt and Syria. And they developed not because of Chinese imports, but in the response of the drying up of the supply of red slipped wares when those kilns were originally destroyed by the arrival of the Arab armies. Analytical work by Mujan Mateen and Mike Tite, among others, have shown that potters developed new glaze styles, Coptic glazewares and yellow family wares, using lead glazes opacified with yellow tin oxide, and that likely resulted from cross-craft interactions with Byzantine glassmakers. This yellow glaze then spread to Mesopotamia, including at sites like Susa, where in the 9th century, it provided the context for the emergence of white tin opacified wares, and then that was the technology that was used to imitate Chinese imports, like this. So this work has shown that the first Islamic glazewares originated from cross-craft interactions, and as the technology spread to Mesopotamia, it was further adapted and refined to produce white tin opacified wares. So the original model has really been well critiqued for Western Asia, but what is happening when we get into Central Asia? So to answer this, the study examines ceramics from the Samanid and the Karakhanid periods, produced in Bukhara and Tashkent, to explore how glazing technologies was transmitted, adopted, and adapted in response to the influx of non-local goods and people. So I'm going to start by talking about the opaque wares, and these are just the ware types on the left-hand side, and across the top, those are the production locations of the different ceramics. So within the opaque wares, we have examples of lusterware, as well as some examples of Syrian yellow glazeware, surprisingly, buffware, and opaque white wares. And we identified 4 different types of opaque glaze. The yellow glazes all have a very high lead glaze, and then the white glazes either have a high lead alkali glaze, a low lead alkali glaze, and then we have one sample that we analyzed which has an alkali lime glaze. There are more, but they weren't in the electron microscopy study. And with the exception of that alkali glaze, the opaque glazes were all opacified with tin particles, and some additionally have quartz particles and air bubbles in the glaze that aid in opacification. And we can compare these types to previously characterized opaque glazes from across the Islamic world, both in terms of their chemistry and their microstructure. And 3 are extremely similar to previously analyzed material in both respects. So the high lead yellow glazes, the low lead alkali glazes, and the alkali lime glazes are known technologies. And in some cases, that technological uniformity, coupled with their paste compositional signature, help us confirm their production location. So the lusterware samples, for instance, which have a low lead alkali composition, are remarkably similar in both their composition and their microstructure to lusterware from Samara, suggesting that our samples were produced in the same location, probably in Samara. So they're imported into the region. Similarly, alkali lime glaze in our assemblage is almost identical in composition and microstructure to this Ishkur style glaze that was analyzed from Tashkent by Christina Henshaw. Ishkur is a plant ash alkali glaze unique to Transoxiana, and it's thought to be a local invention. And Henshaw didn't do any provenance work in her studies, but our NAA identification of this sample as coming from Tashkent confirms that Ishkur style glaze was produced in Chach in the early Islamic period. In other cases, the technological uniformity informs us about the spread of a technology, so not just the movement of a good. So the opaque yellow glaze in our assemblage is remarkably similar to yellow glazes produced across Central Asia, Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. And this suggests that the production of the opaque glaze is extremely standardized, and that standardization was maintained as it spread into Central Asia. And these are some of the earliest wares that were produced in the Islamic period, and that standardization and glaze recipe could lend credence to the theory that the spread of the glaze wares was facilitated, at least initially, by the movement of skilled craftspeople, that we're actually seeing migration of potters in this case. Similarly, the high lead alkali glazes in our study, which were produced in Samarkand and Bukhara, have the same composition and microstructure to comparative data from Egypt and the Levant, which again suggests that this technology is static as it spreads into the region. However, not all of our samples are identical. So this example of which has a high lead alkali glaze composition in a layered sense, I think you can see that there's slightly two different glaze layers there, is not similar to any previously known material that have a white glaze, but is similar to one sample from northwestern Iran, which could suggest that there is a local indigenous opaque glazing technology. But it was probably an innovation on the standard technique by local potters. Turning to the transparent glazes, we characterize Samanid period slipwares that were made in Bukhara and Tashkent, as well as Karakhanid slipwares made in Tashkent and Taraz. And then we had splashwares coming from Samarkand and monochrome green glazes that were produced in the Bukhara oasis in Paikent. And all the transparent glazes have what's classified as a high lead glaze with 40 to 68% lead oxide. And we can look at that glaze composition in more detail to try to identify trends by production location. And so this is the result of a principal component analysis. You don't need to know what that is. But it considers all major element compositions at the same time. And what we see is that the distribution of compositions in Bukhara and Tashkent are almost identical. And that suggests that the glaze recipe and the control of the raw material in these two production locations are very similar across different glazed wares. If we break the samples down by ware type, however, we get some compositional distinction. I'm only going to talk about the slipwares today, but the Karakhanid slipwares have a higher lead oxide concentration than the Samanid slipwares. So we are getting some difference in the technology based on period, but not by site. The Samanid slipwares include a wide range of decorations, including monochrome and polychrome designs in brown, red, and/or olive decorations. And the vessels could have a single layer of white base slip applied, like we see in this example from Bukhara, or they could have multiple layers of white base applied and multiple layers of the painted decoration to create those really striking decorations. And the use of one slip versus two doesn't seem to be reflective of a specific production location. And we observe single and base layers from both Bukhara and from Tashkent. The white slip is compositionally and microstructurally very distinct from the fabric. It's not the same material. And it appears to be a composition of a low iron clay mixed with a lot of quartz and lead oxide, with the lead concentrations averaging 10 to 20 weight percent. And so this is an intentional decision to add lead to the slip. And it's not simply a result of the firing process. The red, brown, and olive decoration were all achieved in the same way, where they finely ground pigments and mixed them with what appears to be the exact white slip to create those colored decorations. The brown has an iron and manganese oxide pigment, the olive uses chromite, and the red slip was achieved by using finely ground hematite. And this is as opposed to a red slip, like a clay slip. And these designs were often enhanced with incision, and the incision was controlled to only penetrate the colored slip layers and not the underlying white slip. So this is what an incised thing looks like in cross-section. The Karakhanid slips are similar to the Samanid slipwares in their general structure, but again, they have more lead in the base glaze recipe. And the transparent glaze has a yellow tint, which comes from chromite. So it doesn't come from silver or antimony, it comes from chromite. And the chromite is present in the glaze as these large black-brown particles. And this stands in contrast to the earlier period olive slips, where you have finely ground chromite particles. Here they're using very large grains. And the chromite in these samples have almost identical composition to chromite in samples from Kuva in the Fergana Valley that were analyzed by Christina Henshaw. So we're not sure where this chromite source is, but its consistent chemical signature found across sites, so in Kuva, in the Fergana Valley, in Tashkent, and in Bukhara, suggests the exploitation of a single mineral source. So if anybody knows where chromite particles are, let me know. So looking at the broader picture, the pottery assemblages from Bukhara and Tashkent tell kind of a complex story. In Bukhara, we see both imported prestige ceramics from Western Islamic world, and then a limited local production of the high lead opaque alkali glazes. And that was likely introduced with little local innovation. And this suggests that glazed ceramic production in Bukhara was rather tightly controlled. In contrast, Tashkent shows no evidence of such imports, although I have to say when I selected samples, I was looking at things that had been classified as tchotch in their style, so this could be sampling bias. But instead what we find is a variety of locally produced opaque wares, including ones that were made by directly introduced technology, ones that were made by a local invention, and ones which appear to be an innovation on an introduced technique. And this suggests that in Tashkent there were perhaps more glazed ceramic workshops and or that the potters had more freedom to experiment in their production process. We see a similar pattern with the transparent glazes. In Bukhara, we also see imports. For the transparent glazes, these are coming from other Central Asian cities as opposed to Western Asia, but that's just a reflection of the stylistic preferences. But we also see locally made Samanid slipwares in Bukhara. Tashkent, however, shows only local production, including both Samanid and later Karakhanid slipware types. And those Karakhanid glazes were also exported to Taraz. And we also see the local production of that glaze type in Taraz using the exact same technology, which suggests that there was knowledge sharing between those two centers. So across Transoxiana, these vessels all use very similar decorative methods. Technologically, the glaze recipes, the slips, and the colorants are consistent, with no detectable differences between production centers. We also don't observe any difference in the motifs used in their decoration, which I'm not going to show you too much today, but it's pretty disappointing in terms of trying to use stylistic analysis to identify the production location. But what we see is that once this slipware technology was established in Transoxiana, it was very standardized. So while the ceramic assemblages from Bukhara and Tashkent share many features, we also observe differences, and those are likely reflective of their position in the region. So Bukhara was the capital. It shows more imported pottery, both from Transoxiana and from Western Asia, especially Iraq. And this is likely driven by an elite demand for expensive, prestigious goods. However, imports were not the main source of glazed pottery in Bukhara. There was local production with a strong focus on slipwares. And this indicates a more tightly controlled production of glazed ceramics in the capital. Whether this is the case of direct control, perhaps guild regulation, or just a reflection of a strong aesthetic preference, which led to increased production uniformity, I can't say at the moment, but I would love to hear what you guys think, and I think it warrants further investigation. Tashkent, by contrast, displays a more diverse and experimental pottery production, consistent with looser control, and this is possibly reflective of its position more on the periphery of this region, and especially on the Islamic Empire in the period. So our new work on material from Bukhara and Tashkent, I think, has aided our understanding of the archaeology of the region, even if it's just confirming some previous trends. But I also think it's an interesting case about how to think about broader questions of technological diffusion that I mentioned at the beginning. So if you're going to indulge me, I have like 7 minutes left, I think. I'm going to talk about how this fits into our broader understanding of Islamic glazed ceramics and studies of innovation. So the pattern of innovation in peripheral regions is not unique to Transoxiana. So recent studies in Cordoba by Salinas and Pradel, in Tunisia and eastern Algeria, led by Okari, and then some of my own work in the Talas Valley north of the Tian Shan, has documented the emergence of innovative ceramic technologies in these so-called marginal areas. These are all different innovative ceramic technologies, but they're happening roughly at the same time. And these findings kind of challenge that traditional narrative of innovation, which I mentioned earlier, which assumes that innovation flowed from a core urban center to more peripheral regions. Instead, these trends reveal that peripheral regions were not passive recipients, but active contributors to technological development in the early Islamic world. And to think about how innovation happens in these regions, I think we need to move beyond the notion that peripheries are passive zones. So Catherine Fryman has suggested that we reconceptualize peripheries as frontiers, so regions of intense cross-cultural interactions that resulted in dynamic and creative technological innovations. So frontiers are these highly heterogeneous spaces where people of different cultures, ways of life, technologies, and belief come into contact and coexist. And engaging with each other, they often develop new material classes, sometimes termed boundary objects, which are things that cross social boundaries instead of demarcate them. And they maybe have different meanings to different social worlds, but at the same time, they're instantly recognizable across those different spaces. And so these objects differences, and in the process, they create new social and material forms. So ceramics, especially decorative ceramics, are really prone to serving as such hybrid objects. Research has shown that different aspects of the ceramic chien operatoire have different resistances to change, resulting in objects that can have clear integration of distinct socially defined aspects. And these can be directly observed in the archaeological material. So to use an early Islamic example, Coptic glazed wares have had their chien operatoire reconstructed by Ting and Taxel. And in the process, they revealed that certain aspects of production were quite novel, while others were conservative. So potters were experimenting with their decorative techniques. They were still using to decorate them in a method that was familiar to them. So here they're painting their glaze on, as opposed to using an all-over glaze. And that's similar to the clay-based slips that they painted with before, in the period immediately preceding it. But they were using a new medium. They were using a glazed paint. And that stood in stark contrast to the standardized conservative way that these ceramics were formed and their morphology that was shared with the preceding materials. And that's because the shaping of a ceramic is an embodied experience. And so it's really hard to teach a potter how to make a new type of pot after you initially train them. So it was through that integration of distinct technological and stylistic aspects into a single object where we're starting to see technological innovation. And that innovation is often happening in frontier regions, where cross-cultural and cross-craft interactions may have been more fluid and frequent than in core regions, where craft production is often more isolated or controlled. But that's not to say that Samanid slipwares, especially these epigraphic examples, weren't themselves highly innovative. And so here I'm showing you the famous bull from the Freers Gallery, which was probably made in Tashkent, as well as the material that I analyzed from Tashkent and Bukhara. And these ceramics introduced really new visual effects by combining slip painting with an all-over transparent glaze, resulting in striking high-contrast designs. Technologically, they're much more complex than other transparent glazewares, and this is reflective of the local ingenuity of potters. For example, by adding a small amount of lead flux to that high silica slip, potters were ensuring that the slip adhered to the body while maintaining its brilliant white color. The ceramics were also bisque fired before they were glazed, which is a step that wasn't required for other types of monochrome or splashed wares. Yeah. And this process prevented any unwanted crystal formation on the slip glaze interface, which would have muddled the design. Instead, here you get this extra decorative step that ensured a clear, crisp finish. Again, incision where used was precisely controlled to enhance the decorative contrast rather than cutting through to the underlying ceramic fabric, which is another departure from other transparent wares where they cut straight through. The decoration themselves were also highly innovative and distinct, and so art history is not my bag, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm sure others have thoughts about why people were putting Arabic designs on pots that were consumed in a Persian-speaking region. And so I think the widespread presence, it's that application of script, which is really interesting. And we also see the use of pseudo-inscriptions. And that's a further testament to the fact that people didn't necessarily need to be able to read these objects, but having that script on them was what was an important feature. And so these ceramics were innovative as the result of integrating pre-existing styles into a new mode of ceramic that was being consumed in the region. So broadly, I think that these results kind of fit into our pre-existing knowledge that across the Islamic world, including in Transoxiana, we see widespread technological innovation in ceramics and glazes. We're not seeing technological uniformity, we're seeing technological heterogeneity. And while all of these wares are heterogeneous, they're all making use of the same structural component, which is a glaze. And that is the unifying component that links these ceramics to the broader Islamic tradition. So local communities were taking this core glaze technology and adapting it, combining it with existing forms and styles to create regionally distinct yet culturally recognizable wares. And it is that integration of distinct technological or stylistic aspects into one object which leads to technological innovation more broadly. And so these glazed ceramics were serving to bridge the differences between people within the Islamic world, especially those on frontier regions, and help anchor their interactions within a shared sphere. So I hope that this has highlighted the fact that by focusing on how ceramics were made and who made them, we can gain a better understanding of the mechanisms of cultural contact, community formation, and material culture diffusion. So.
Thank you, Kate. This was very exciting and beautifully presented. I have one comment, which is that I would be very curious if the human remains that you found in the same site show evidence of lead poisoning, if that's something that the person who's working on that material could investigate. Because you're emphasizing the importance of lead in the ceramic production process. And then my main question is about the dates. Yeah. Do you have datable assemblages, or is the technological development kind of floating in time at the moment?
Okay, so I looked at Soren. Soren says no for the lead poisoning. I also don't know if we've ever found an individual that we would think of as a potter. I would be very interested if that is the case, if anybody knows of one. But yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they were consuming some amount of lead oxide, but also lead was used all over the place. Everybody had a little bit of lead poisoning in the past. So for the dating, so from Bukhara, we have single deposits, so they're in these waste pits, they're in these badrabs. And we do have some coins from some of those deposits. We also have a lot of stylistic analysis. And so this is where, and we have some C14 dating. But honestly, with ceramics, you can do a lot with stylistic identifications because they change so rapidly. And you can see that change happening through time. I mean, it's like old school seriation. It actually works in a lot of this region. So yeah, it's most of the dates are not anchored by absolute dating or by coins, but some of them are. And I think roughly we can think about these as 9th, 10th century. Yeah.
It's not exactly a question, I don't know, but have you found you show some Chinese example. I don't know if you have found some remainings, especially I suppose 9th, 10th century, I would say Sung dynasty. And I was wondering if this innovation related to glaze is related to the export of porcelain. Because porcelain, of course, is transparent. There's all the glaze process in China, started from the Song, then became more popular with the blue and white porcelain that everyone tried to copy. And so I'm wondering if all this glaze is due to the import of porcelain that highly glazed.
Okay, so not initially. So we have Islamic glazes that predate the ones that are imitating the Chinese imports. And also they start with a yellow glazing technology, not a white glazing technology. So there definitely is an innovation that they, in some ways, are using white to maybe mimic porcelain, but I don't think that's the primary reason of making these glazewares. Also, like with the epigraphic examples, that white may not be imitating porcelain, it may be imitating, no, what do you write on? It's not vellum. Parchment? No, it's not paper. Is it paper? Yeah, okay. Parchment, it's parchment, thank you. So like that's another thing where it's like people have long time thought that these were imitating Chinese porcelains, but I don't think that's as much the case. Additionally, the blue and white started in the Islamic world, went to China, and then came back.
Yeah.
So that's a fun little development that happened.
Another interface. Yes, and then Bertil.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. And obviously, I'm here on behalf of my whole family. So the question is, so people after presentations on those ceramics often ask about whether they were actually used as tablewares, especially as they get more decorative, and especially with those inscriptions that are often of religious content. So, I guess, is there any way through your analysis to find out if they were food was actually consumed. Because, you sometimes buy decorative ceramics nowadays and they tell you, like, don't ever eat on it. And so I don't know if that is something through some cracks or any.
So unfortunately, because they're glazed, they aren't porous, and so we can't do things like lipid analysis of the ceramic fabrics like we can do for like cooking pots and things like that. I think that some of them probably were used to actually eat with, but also because some of the inscriptions have things that say like eat up at the bottom, so like that would have been revealed as you're consuming things out of the bowl. There are some, I think it's a house in Nishapur that has niches that are almost the exact same size as like the normal plates and bowls, so that they think that they were kind of displaying them on the wall like you would, like in a modern pottery cabinet. So I think there is some aspect of display, but there is just too many of these to only be decorative wall art, and also the fact that they are actual shapes and vessels. So they were using them.
Yes, please. I was wondering your difference between Tashkent and Bukhara. I don't remember the exact name you said. One was more restricted in technological point of view, and the other one more opened. And maybe this would be a difference between actual potters coming from the west in Bukhara, because it was the main capital, and but not in Tashkent.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. Or that there was some sort of regulation, like there was some sort of pottery control in these urban centers. I think it's more reflective that there was probably more workshops operating in Tashkent or in the Chach region. And they were producing quite a lot of glazed ceramics. And in fact, I think quite a lot of the glazed ceramics that we see in like museum collections and everything are probably coming from Chach as opposed to Samarkand or Nishapur. I didn't also mention this, but interestingly, in our NAA study, we found Samarkand material in Bukhara, we found Tashkent material in Bukhara, we found no Nishapur material in either Bukhara or in Samarkand. So I don't know, maybe the flow of goods didn't move in that direction. They were moving to the west as opposed to the east. But yeah, the different centers had different, I think, scales of pottery production for like local consumption and for a wider export market.
Sasha?
I have one question, very specific. Another chart with these general things. Near Bukhara, you have a vessel which looks Mesopotamian to me. Is it, if I'm correct? I was wondering if it's from your guys' excavations.
No.
Yeah, that one with a splash where green and Kufik inscription on the right side.
Yeah, well, I think theoretically it's supposed to come from Nishapur.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But whether it was locally produced there or not.
Usually, I mean, this yeah, okay.
Can't tell.
All right. And that's one question. And the second one is, well, you have a wonderful sample,
Yeah.
but of course there were analyses done before, particularly Grajdankina did large bulk of analysis. And I don't know if they're usable still, because of course you use somewhat different quality machinery and quite different things, but she accumulated quite a lot. She has a book published, monograph, and then there was a collection of articles. I dealt with her archive. She died in Moscow, and we passed her archive back to Tashkent back 1986, maybe.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of unpublished analysis of material, and she was good. She was actually, well, she was a scientist and very high quality scientist. So I thought you might expand your base by this, really seriously, because she did a lot in Tashkent and Samarkand. Well, partially it was utilized by Shishkina in her glazed pottery of Sogd, right? Because all this bloom boom, that and that things which are underneath each thing, they are, of course, not exhaustive, but suggesting at least, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing about this also, I'm sure that, well, once more, I saw that you have a lot of badarabs, happy life. I remember how on the Python I had 48 pits on 400 meters. So that makes life beautiful. I even fell in one of them. That is a well-known story in Central Asian archaeology. But the whole story is that that what gives you Badaraps, gives you chronology very well. And what is interesting, in Samarkand and Tashkent, actually in Kavardan, we talked about last time about Kavardan, there are a lot of these Badaraps, which you actually can study in various kinds of construction sites and so on. In Bukhara, we didn't have this chance.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because that creates a situation when your sample is somewhat limited. Maybe it's just part of a city which had just one shop working in the southern part of the city of Bukhara. So sample is not big enough to, I would say, to come with this conclusion about restriction, especially if you want the city control.
Yeah.
My God, that would be something very unusual for early Islamic society. And the last thing, I think it would be nice to mention that probably the development, this crazy development of beauty in Islamic pottery is a result of restrictions on luxury vessels, which comes out of Sahih of Bukhari and two hadith, which actually forbid you to use silver and gold.
Yeah.
And you can see it, for example, from the description of Ibn Battuta's travel to Khwarezm, where he says that every person at the table of Khwarezm Shah actually eats from different type of pottery according to his piousness.
Yeah.
So, and pious people who actually wanted luxury would use these beautiful vessels.
Yeah.
So that's, anyway, sorry for being so.
No, it's all very points. For the previous studies that were, we can use them for technological analysis. We can't use them for provenance work. And also, I didn't mention this because it's not the main point of the presentation. We were able to really clearly distinguish Tashkent and Bukhara by their compositional things, but not based on their major elemental contribution. So they have very similar major elements. They have very different trace elements, including rare earth elements. That's great because we can use things like NAA to distinguish the two production centers. We can't use things like XRF to do it, which are more widely available techniques, and we can't compare between techniques. So even though they clearly are two different fabric groups, it's really, really difficult to identify those by a technique other than NAA or LAICPMS. So, yeah. And as for your other points, I think the chronology, I just want to briefly mention. So when I'm distinguishing between Samanid and Karakhanid period here, I'm only considering those distinctive yellow vessels that come in the Karakhanid period. I'm not considering all of the slipwares that sometimes people date to the Karakhanid period because they just look a bit shit. So that's one of the ways of dating, and I think we need a lot more chronological control before we can make that claim.
Good.
Take 5 minutes break.